Good evening and welcome to Dark Historian. You're in a quiet place now, made for slow stories, soft thoughts, and peaceful sleep. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let the day gently fade away. Tonight, we'll explore the quieter side of history, simple lives, strange old customs, and forgotten moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. If this calm journey brings you peace or helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe, only if it feels right. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin. Asterisk Story 1. The daily diet of dust and beans breakfasts, boiled in soot and silence. Asterisk. The sun has not yet breached the horizon. The air is chilled and dry, with the promise of dust just beginning to stir. You sit up stiffly on a woolen blanket, the ground beneath you still damp from the night's dew. A faint snore issues from the canvas tent behind you, but otherwise the camp is silent except for the occasional creak of a wagon settling into the soft earth. This is the Oregon Trail in its earliest hours, a world of quiet labor and slow awakenings. You reach for your boots, crusted in yesterday's mud, and begin the daily ritual of shaking them out for spiders. The smell of ash lingers from the campfire, now just embers. Around you, others begin to rise, some groaning from cramped sleep, others already feeding fires with damp sticks and buffalo chips. You are not rushing. No one rushes here. There is nowhere to rush to. The quiet struggle of breakfast, if it can be called that, is not a hot skillet filled with sizzling bacon and eggs. It is more often a kettle of weak cornmeal mush, simmered in whatever vessel hasn't rusted through. The mush is bland and lumpy, a bit too watery, and it carries the faint taste of smoke. Always smoke. Sometimes there's hardtack, those rock hard crackers made from flour and water, baked until bone dry so they'll last months. You knock one against a wagon wheel and it doesn't crack. You'll need to soak it first in your lukewarm coffee substitute called coffee, but usually made from roasted chicory, dried acorns, or parched corn if you're lucky. The children complain, but softly. Complaints waste energy. You may have beans left from last night, kidney or pinto, softened over hours, and stored in a cracked pot, sloshing about in the wagon. You add more water to stretch them, toss in a pinch of salt if you still have any, and maybe a chunk of rancid bacon rind for flavor. You can't afford to throw anything away. You stir slowly, watching the pot bubble, listening to it hiss like a tired sigh. No one speaks much before breakfast. Food that refused to die the food itself is a kind of test. Dried apples that have gone tough from moisture. Salt pork so dense and briny it squeaks between your teeth. Butter is a memory if you brought any. It melted and curdled long ago. Most families brought barrels of flour, sacks of beans, and slabs of salted meat food that won't rot quickly. But even that food, when kept too close to heat or too far from airflow, begins to grow things. Mold that threads through biscuit barrels, maggots that wriggle through rice sacks. You learn not to look too closely. Flour can be sifted to remove weevils. Bacon can be boiled to drive out the green tint. These are small acts of control in a world that offers little of it. The only truly fresh thing is the air, and even that smells faintly of livestock. 1,000 tiny fires across the plain. You see little plumes of smoke rising from other camps. Your wagon train is only one of many today. Each camp is its own sleepy village, bound together by necessity, not friendship. Breakfast means crouching beside a fire and waiting. Everyone waits for water to boil, for pots to be scraped, for spoons to cool. You eat standing up or squatting, on your heels, sometimes from a tin plate, sometimes directly from the pot. The fires burn low, out of caution. Fuel is precious. Most fires are fed with prairie coal, buffalo dung, dried by the sun and collected in armfuls. It burns hot but smoky, and the smell clings to everything. To your shirt, your hands, the corners of your eyes. You wipe your nose with a sleeve that smells of dung and bacon grease. The beans are ready. The ritual of cleaning, or not theirs. No soap left not, real soap. You might have some lye chips, but they're used sparingly. For laundry when absolutely necessary. Cleaning dishes means rinsing them in a bucket of cloudy water and wiping them out with the corner of your shirt. No one comments. Everyone eats from dishes with a thin film of last night's supper. There's a kind of quiet resignation in this, a slowing down, an acceptance. The clink of tin spoons against iron pots is the only sound for a while, and then, with the food eaten and the fire banked, the packing begins again. Dinner on the move, hunger between wagon wheels. Asterisk, by mid-morning, the sun is high, and so is the dust. It rolls in slow waves behind the wagon wheels, coating everything: your boots, your lips, the backs of your ears in a fine, chalky film. You taste it when you swallow. You feel it under your fingernails. Even your water has turned the color of weak tea. The wagons lurch forward, their wheels creaking, pulled by tired oxen that plod at the same resigned pace every day. There's no stopping to make lunch. Lunch, like most comforts, has become a memory. Midday food is a handful of dried apple slices, or a square of cornbread gone brittle from the wind. Maybe a strip of dried beef, if the flies haven't claimed it first. And so the day stretches. Dust, sun, wind, thirst and hunger, but never quite leaves you. Eating while walking the trail waits for no one. If you want to eat, you eat while walking. You might fish a cold bean biscuit from a cloth bundle, gnawing on it as you trudge behind the wagon. There are no tables, no forks, no hand washing, just cracked hands, sunburnt lips, and the slow crunch of something hard and tasteless between your teeth. Children are given dry crackers or parched, corn to chew on, not because they're delicious, but because chewing keeps them quiet. A mother might pass a tin mug of thin broth from one child to the next. It splashes, the youngest spills. No one scolds. There is nothing to scold downly the effort of survival. When the supplies go wrong, what you eat depends on what hasn't spoiled, been spilled, or gone moldy. Every week, another family discovers a barrel ruined flour turned sour, rice crawling with beetles, pickled vegetables fermented too far. If you lose your beans to rot, you stretch your meals with extra water and prayer. If you lose your salt, you learn what bland truly means. If your sugar hardens into a brick, you chip at it like stone. Meals become an experiment in endurance. You discover how long you can eat without appetite, how hunger changes what you consider edible. The trail butchers. Sometimes someone butchers a cow, not because they want to, but because it has broken a leg or gone lame. There is no use in keeping an injured oxen, so they kill it, right there by the trail, and the air fills with the metallic scent of fresh meat. There is no waste. Strips of meat are hung on ropes tied between wagons, jerking in the wind as they dry. The tongue is eaten first, the kidneys next. Some boil the hooves for soup, scraping every bit of marrow from the bones. Others gather around and barter for a strip of flank or shoulder. It will feed their family for a day, but meat turns quickly in the heat. If you do not eat it by sundown, you risk more than hunger. You risk illness. Dysentery soup and stomachs are rarely calm on the Oregon Trail. Water is drawn from creeks used by both humans and animals. It is often full of things you cannot see. Dysentery, what they call the bloody flux, is one of the most common afflictions. It begins quietly, a stomach cramp, then diarrhea, weakness, fatigue. You stop eating, not by choice, but because food will not stay down. And yet, the wagons roll on. You climb into one to lie flat, feeling every rock beneath the wheels as your body tries to heal. Those who cannot eat are given rice water, if there's any rice left, sometimes bread soaked. In warm milk, more often, nothing. There are no doctors here, only folk remedies and hope. Some chew on willow bark for pain. Others boil sagebrush into a bitter tea and sip it slowly while staring out at the endless plains. You wonder how many others died like this, on an empty stomach, staring at this same horizon. A supper circle of tin plates and tired eyes as dusk falls. The wagons form a ragged circle, not for defense, but for convenience. Fires are lit again, and the air fills with smoke and soft murmurs. Supper is much like breakfast, but with slightly more ceremony. Families gather, spoons clink. Someone sings softly to a baby. You boil beans, again. Maybe you mix in rice or dried onions. If you're lucky, you caught a rabbit that morning, thin, sinewy meat that adds a whisper of flavor. Someone nearby brews coffee, and the scent travels far, comforting even if you have none of your own. Children fall asleep in laps before the plates are cleared. The wind rises. You chew slowly, watching the firelight flicker on the faces of strangers who now feel like kin. You do not speak of hunger anymore. It is a constant companion, a quiet neighbor you no longer question. And yet, as you lie down, in the dust again, belly half full, eyes already closing, you wonder, what will you eat tomorrow? Improvising hunger when the food ran out, the plains were not generous. By the third or fourth week, many wagons had lost something. Vittle flour gone damp and grey with mold, eggs shattered in their crates, butter long since melted into a rancid puddle. The barrels that once smelled of spices and promise now reeked of mildew and disappointment. Still, the wagons rolled forward. Hunger is not always sudden. Sometimes it creeps like a low fog, stretching from the base of your throat to the pit of your belly, the kind of hunger that lingers after a meal, that stains your dreams. You learn to adapt, not with grand plans or daring solutions, but with slow, steady compromises, like using sour creek water to thin a soup that doesn't quite exist, or scrubbing green spots off old potatoes and hoping they weren't the poisonous kind, wild foraging. A gamble with every bite as provisions dwindled. The trail became a scavenger's corridor. You walked with your head low, eyes scanning the soil and scrub. Some families sent their older children ahead to collect edible plants, wild onions, dandelion greens, lamb's quarters. There were roots too, prairie turnips dug from hard-packed earth, and wild carrots that looked a little too much like poison hemlock. Identification was life or death. A wrong bite could mean a tight throat, a burning gut, a quiet burial at dusk. You relied on memory, or worse, on rumor. They say you can eat the flowers with 5 petals, but not 6. Boil it twice, and the bitterness goes away. No one really knew. You ate cautiously, You also learned to collect things that no one back east would have considered food. Grasshoppers toasted on flat stones. Grubs roasted until they popped. You didn't talk about it afterward. The great bread. Experiments with yeast long gone and baking powder in short supply, travelers became accidental chemists. They experimented with trail bread, a sort of leathery flatbread made from flour, water, and whatever fat was still liquid. Some tried ash cakes, burying dough in coals and hoping for the best. Others boiled dough into dumplings and dropped them into weak meat broths, hoping they'd swell enough to satisfy. One woman in an 1847 diary wrote of adding dry mustard and pickling spice to old biscuits to trick her children into thinking it was new food. They didn't believe her, but they ate it anyway. You learned to chew slowly, to savor texture when flavor was absent, and sometimes you laughed. A dry, low kind of laughter that didn't last long. Salt, sweetness, and small luxuries when salt ran out, everything went flat. You didn't realize how much you relied on it until the beans tasted like wet newspaper. Sugar was gone even sooner. If someone had a cone of palencia or brown molasses, they guarded it fiercely, shaving off curls, like gold dust. A spoon of sweetened coffee was a reason to sit still, close your eyes, and remember better days. There were trail luxuries. Peppermint drops hidden in coat pockets. A tin of cinnamon meant for Christmas that got used on a pot of boiled apples. One man traded a pocket knife for a single lemon. His wife was feverish, and he believed it would help. She passed away before the lemon arrived. These were not just foods, they were symbols of comfort, of effort, of care in a world that offered very little of it. Trading and trail bartering when your food ran low, you looked to others. Some wagon trains were generous. They shared extra flour for a promise, or a pair of socks in return. Others were strict. Bartering became a quiet economy. Coffee traded for bullets, lard for sewing needles, dried peaches for a night's use of a better fire. Children whispered about families who still had candy. Women bartered recipes like secrets how to soften hardtack, how to stretch cornmeal, how to disguise spoiled meat. But not everyone played fair. There were accusations. A man once sold a cheese that turned out to be a carved hunk of tallow. No one forgot. Eating the animals when food grew truly scarce. You looked at your own animals differently. The chickens were first. They provided eggs, but when cornmeal ran out, they weren't worth the feed. You plucked feathers slowly, ashamed and grateful. Then the dogs. Some families couldn't bear it. Others did what they had to. Diarists mention it in fragments. By name, he was loyal, but we were starving. Horses were next, though few survived the long haul to that decision. The oxen, too. If they grew lame, that you did not cry over these meals. You ate with your head down. A meal of mud and memory when all else failed. You boiled bark. You steeped pine needles. You made tea out of burnt cornmeal and weeds. You dug up old leather straps, shaved them, boiled them, and ate them like noodles. They softened just enough to be swallowed. And while you chewed, you told stories about dinners you once had in Missouri, about your grandmother's molasses cake, about sweet butter on hot bread. You told stories not to torment yourself, but to stay human. The food was gone, but the memory was seasoning. It made the fire warmer, the night gentler. When the trail broke, the body without food, your mind wandered. You stood beside the wagon and couldn't recall what you were fetching. You stirred the pot and forgot to add beans. Children grew listless. Mothers tore off strips of their own skirts to use as bandages when dysentery struck again. Men walked, slower, leaning more heavily on their rifles. Some grew bloated, Belize sign of starvation. Others grew hollow and silent, and yet, each morning, they rose, lit fires, boiled water. Tied up their boots to live was to keep moving. Faith, folklore, and fasting in the leanest moments. People prayed not for miracles, but for enough food to last one more day. Some held fasts deliberately, believing hunger brought them closer to God. Others told stories of saints who lived on berries, monks who drank only water. A few spoke of visions of gardens, of orchards heavy with peaches, of roast beef and buttered bread. Were they dreams? Hallucinations? Messages? No one dared to say, but everyone listened. Everyone hoped. Arrival meant nothing even when you reached a fort or river crossing. There were no guarantees. If the trading post had flour, it might cost 3 times what you had left. If they had beans, they might be old, weevil-ridden, or rotting. Some families pawned wedding rings for bacon. Others offered rifles, only to find there were no goods left. To buy a bag of rice could mean the difference between sickness and survival. But even when you got it, it was just one meal. The taste of dirt and rain. Eventually your tongue changed. You could taste moisture in the wind. You could tell good soil from bitter just by smell. Rain became a flavor, dust a texture, hunger a background hum. You could tell when a rabbit had passed nearby, when wild mint grew near the creek. You became something more than a traveler, part predator, part monk, part scavenger. You ate less, thought more, sat longer beside the fire, chewing slowly, not from etiquette, but from necessity. And you lived as the stars blink out one by one and the fire dies low. Your belly is not full, but it is no longer empty. You sleep, not dreaming of feasts or parties, or banquets, but of a warm bowl of something simple, a piece of bread without mold, a hot meal eaten without fear. Tomorrow you'll look for more, but for tonight you rest. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Story 2. Wagon ruts and wooden bones. Why everything hurt all the time, * blisters. Bones, and the daily cost of walking west, * you rise before the sun again. Not because you want to, but because your body won't let you stay still any longer. Your hip aches from where it pressed into a tree root all night. Your ankles are stiff. Your spine feels splintered from too many nights on the hard ground. There is no bed to stretch in, no warm basin to soak your feet, no soft floor to pace across, just the coarse, dry plain beneath you. This is not a story of dramatic injuries or spectacular illness. This is the slow, quiet war your body fights every day. A war of shoes too tight, of wagon jolts felt in the marrow, of sunburns and saddle, sores, of blisters that weep, and still you walk. Every day you walk. The pain in the morning, the body doesn't spring to life on the Oregon Trail. It groans into movement. Your joints are slow to obey. Your calves cramp before you stand upright. Knees grind. Toes throb. Even the act of dressing feels like a small ordeal. Shirts stick to your back. The laces on your boots are stiff with dust and sweat. You tug and tug. If you're lucky, your fingers aren't too swollen to manage them. And yet, as the sky turns pale and the first fires spark to life, you do what you always do. You gather your aching limbs, straighten your spine, and prepare to walk again. There are no sick days on the trail. The trail eats your feet, most people. Don't imagine the Oregon Trail starting with blood, but that's where it begins. Your heels dot within days, boots that once fit well begin to rub. Dust creeps inside, socks wear thin. The friction never stops. Blisters swell, then burst. Calluses form, crack, and bleed. Toenails blacken and fall off. You walk anyway. Some wrap their feet in oiled cloth. Others cut slits in their shoes to relieve the pressure. A few go barefoot, at least until the terrain grows rocky. Children cry at first. Then they stop. Their feet harden. Their pain becomes normal. The creak of wooden bones. Your back was not made for this. Not for bending over a campfire 6 times a day. Not for lifting barrels into wagons. Not for climbing in and out of a buckboard seat that jolts with every rut. Most of the trail is uneven. Sometimes it slopes. Sometimes it sinks. The wagons follow deep grooves etched by hundreds who came before. Those ruts jerk your body sideways, jostle your spine. The wooden benches offer no cushion. You feel every mile in your lower back, in the base of your neck, in the soft tissue between your shoulders. You try to stretch, but the tightness only shifts. The pain doesn't scream. It hums. It waits. It settles in your bones like old dust. Hands that don't heal, every chore bites your hands. The rope burns from tying oxen, the splinters from broken wagon frames, the grease from the wheels that never washes away. You rub lard into the cracks in your knuckles. You tie cloth strips around your thumbs where the skin has split. The blisters form layers old over new, soft over raw. Dot, and yet you keep working because you must. Because everyone else does. Even children. Especially children. Children who limp before they grow the youngest are not spared. Girls carry buckets. Boys drive oxen. They learn early that aching is part of the routine. Knees swell, shins bruise. They fall, scrape, cry and then keep going. Children limp by evening. Their eyes glaze over. They sit near the fire, holding tin mugs between hands too small to carry the day's weight. And still, tomorrow, they will walk again. Their legs stiff, their spirits soft, their dreams scattered by exhaustion. The ache of repetition, the pain, isn't always from trauma. Often, it's the repetition that wears you down. The same movements, over and over. Hoist, bend, lift, walk, tie, stir, shake, rub. Muscles lock into routines. Joints wear unevenly. Your elbows hurt from holding the reins too tight. Your shoulders ache from chopping wood with a dull axe. Even your jaw aches from clenching it against the wind, the dust, the frustration. You don't notice it until you try to chew, and then you keep chewing anyway. The invisible weight of the sun does not always burn. Sometimes it presses. A heavy, golden weight that rests on your shoulders, your scalp, your brow. It draws the sweat from your skin, dries your lips into thin cracks, makes your shirt stick to you like old paper. You feel your heartbeat in your temples. Your vision narrows. You slow down, but you keep going. Some collapse, most don't. They simply wilt. Aches that steal your sleep. The worst pain doesn't strike during the day. It waits until night, when the fire dies down and the air cools. Your muscles protest the stillness. Your knees twitch. Your back pulses. Your hips go numb. There's no mattress, no pillow, no gentle bed frame. Just your body on the ground, rocks you didn't clear, roots you didn't notice, cold air that seeps up from beneath you. You shift, then shift again. Then lie still and hope sleep finds you first. Remedies that rarely work, there are no pharmacies. On the trail, pain relief is folk knowledge. Dandelion tea for inflammation, whiskey for headaches, hot stones wrapped in cloth for joint pain. Most of the time, you do nothing. You wait, you breathe. You distract yourself with chores, or you share stories around the fire, not for entertainment, but for escape. You tell each other about the comfort of real beds, about the silk of cool sheets, about baths. You say these things out loud because it makes the pain feel less permanent, because you need something to imagine, the unseen toll. There are no gravestones for sore backs, no markers for worn-down knees, but they are everywhere, in the way a man stumbles when he stands, in the way a woman winces when she kneels, in the way a child stops running. Pain becomes the background music of the journey, a quiet drumbeat beneath every step, and yet you walk, because forward is the only direction left. When the body breaks, makeshift healing on the trail * pain, most days, was background noise, but sometimes it stepped forward louder, sharper, undeniable. A twist, a snap, a wound that would not close. This was when you learned just how far you were from help, when pain was no longer a dull throb in your knees, but a sudden shriek in your ankle, when fever bloomed behind your eyes, when blood soaked through your only shirt and wouldn't stop. The Oregon Trail did not wait for injuries. It did not stop for healing. It carried you forward whether your body agreed or not. And so, when the body broke, you didn't rest. You adapted. The misstep that changed everything, the most dangerous injuries, weren't always dramatic. You might step wrong getting out of the wagon and twist your knee, climb a rock too fast and pull something in your back. Sometimes you simply stumbled in a rut those deep, wagon grooves carved by thousands before, and went down hard. A sprain, a fracture, a dislocated shoulder. There were no hospitals, no casts, no doctors, unless a miracle happened to place one in your wagon train. You relied on instincts, whispered remedies, and second-hand advice. The trail taught you quickly. Even a small injury could cost you everything. Setting bones beside the fire ray broken. Limb needed to be set immediately. Not at all. That was the common wisdom. You would lie flat while neighbors held your arms and legs. A makeshift splint was crafted from wagon spokes, branches, or sometimes a butter churn handle. Cloth torn from someone's hem served as binding. The pain was white-hot. The scream, if you allowed one, went unanswered. There were no painkillers, just a stick to bite down on. Afterward, you'd be loaded into the wagon, unable to walk for days or weeks. The jostling ride worsened the pain. Healing came slowly, if at all. Fever and the smell of sweat infection was a constant risk. A small cut on your foot could become red, then purple, then begin to smell. Fever followed. Sweat poured from your skin. You shook with chills even under the midday sun. There were no antibiotics. Boiled water and prayers were the only antiseptics. A poultice made from onions or tobacco might be pressed to the wound. Sometimes the fever broke. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, there were only two choices: be left behind or carried. Carried by wagon, carried by love when someone couldn't walk. They rode. The space inside a wagon was cramped barrels, bedding, boxes' butt. A body in need was squeezed in. They lay on folded blankets or atop sacks of flour. The wagon jolted with every bump. Pain flared with every turn. The sun beat down on the canvas, making it stifling inside. Still, it was better than walking. Sick children were often carried in arms. Fathers hoisted them like sacks of grain. Mothers cradled them even when their own backs screamed. Because what else could they do? Makeshift crutches and stubborn will not. Every injury kept you down. Some limped beside the wagons on homemade crutches branches bound with twine. Others tied stiff boards to their legs and hobbled forward. It was slower, yes, but movement mattered. You needed to keep pace or risk falling behind. There was no cavalry to rescue the injured, no safety net. If you couldn't move, your choices dwindled fast. So people moved, with gritted teeth, with clenched fists. With unyielding stubbornness, you kept going, because you had to. Burned by the trail fires were both friend and foe, in the frenzy of preparing meals or boiling water. Burns were common. Children stumbled into coals. Women knocked over pots. Men grabbed iron handles without a second thought. Burns were soothed with bacon grease, aloe, even cool mud if nothing else was available. Severe ones blistered, then blackened. Skin peeled. Infection followed. You didn't scream. You learned to breathe through it. You avoided looking directly at the wound. When the healers were just humans, some wagon trains were lucky enough to include a doctor or at least someone who had once worked near a doctor. They carried satchels of folded cloth, glass jars with yellowing powders, and long metal instruments wrapped in oilcloth. They set bones, drained abscesses, and offered bitter tinctures that scorched the throat. But even they could only do so much. They worked by firelight, with unwashed hands, with knowledge learned from books, not experience. You trusted them anyway. What choice did you have? Bled, purged, and polka old world medicine still held sway. For fevers, some believed in bloodletting. A slice on the arm, a bowl to catch what drained. Others believed in purging strong laxatives or emetics to clear the body. If your head hurt, you were told too fast. If your stomach hurt, you were told to eat more bread. Some treatments helped, most didn't, but they gave people something to do, something to believe in. Belief was its own kind of medicine. Wounds that wouldn't close a gash from a wagon axle, a nail through the foot, a bite from a wild animal. These wounds took weeks to heal if they ever did. Flies hovered, cloth stuck to dried blood. You changed the wrappings as best you could. If the edges turned black, you knew it was over. There were stories of men sawing off limbs with dull knives, of women who packed wounds with ashes to stop the bleeding. You listened, horrified, then moved on, because you had your own injuries to mind. Chronic pain without a name not. All injuries had names. Some were just aches that never left. A shoulder that never lifted again. A hip that always clicked. You didn't talk about it. You just favored that side when you walked. You used your other hand. Pain became a companion. Not welcome, but familiar. It reminded you were still alive, still. Moving, still on the trail. Burials and unused bootsome did not recover. They were buried just off the road. A wooden marker. A hat placed on the grave. Sometimes a pair of boots left behind to warn for the next person. You didn't stop long, just long enough to cover them. Say a word. Drink some water. Then the wagons moved again. The trail did not pause for sorrow. Strength worn down, not out-owned yet. Most kept going. Worn, yes, but not broken. The human body, battered as it was, found a way. It adjusted, it adapted, it bore. More than it should. And so you walked, limped, crawled, swore, prayed, endured, because west was the only way left. Bodies at the end, the last miles, and quiet survival. Asterisk, the sky grew lower in the last weeks. The trees changed, the soil softened underfoot, and yet your body did not rejoice. You should have been thrilled. You were nearing the end of a journey that had devoured whole years of your life, drained your supplies, and cost you people you loved. But your knees still throbbed, your back still bent like a crooked beam. You were close to your goal, but not whole. The final miles of the Oregon Trail were not victory laps. They were slow, shuffling crawls of bodies that had withstood too much. The false promise of arrival no one tells you that reaching the end doesn't mean your pain goes away. You imagined a moment clear, cinematic when your feet would stop. Aching, your shoulders would straighten, and you'd feel light again. But that moment never came. Instead, your boots stayed soaked from creek crossings. Your joints still cracked every morning, and the aches you thought would pass lingered like old ghosts. This wasn't a finish line. It was just different terrain. Bent backs and bowed heads by now. Every adult in your wagon train had their own gait. The man with the crooked spine walked with a sideways lean. The woman who broke her wrist 2 months back cradled it in her apron. The boy who lost a toe limped forever after, even when the pain had gone. No one moved with ease. You heard groans when people sat, more when they stood. Pain shaped your postures, and yet your heads were not bowed from defeat, but from the simple effort of standing upright through it. Old before their time, you were 30. You felt 80. Your skin was drawn tight around sunken cheeks. Your hands were swollen and darkened from sun and toil. Your eyes had seen too much dust, too many injuries, too many slow deaths by discomfort. Children, too, had changed. Their legs, once soft and clumsy, were now wiry and sure, but their eyes had dulled. Their play had softened into silence. The trail made everyone older, not in years but in weight. The wagons were worn too even, the wagons limped, wheels patched, with iron bands, axles greased with bare fat and desperation. Every creak of wood now sounded more like a groan. The wagons carried what your bodies couldn't, and now they too showed signs of breaking. You knew, in some quiet way, that you and your wagon had become one bent, scraped, held together by will and rope. Final injuries that nearly broke youth, last stretch didn't spare anyone. The rains began again. Mud sucked at your boots. Oxen slipped. Wagons tilted dangerously at riverbanks. A man cracked 2 ribs when a wheel bucked on a stone. A child fell from the driver's seat and landed wrong. And still, you went on, because the pain of stopping was greater than the pain of continuing. The unspoken competition, no one talked about it, but everyone knew. Some families were faring better than others. The Arnolds still had a full barrel of flour. The Thompsons had no visible limps. You envied them quietly. You who hadn't had clean socks in weeks, who rubbed vinegar on your knees at night, and yet somehow you still woke up each day. You still walked. You still lifted and pulled and carried and cooked. There was dignity in surviving, even when your survival looked less graceful. Relearning the body at the campfires now, people spoke less about provisions and more about pain. Still can't bend my elbow. My legs just stop halfway through the day. Feels like there's gravel in my spine. People rubbed each other's shoulders without asking. They passed down crude massage techniques. They soaked feet in warm broth water when they could. Spare it. You learned how to care for each other, not to cure, but to console. Stretching was worship in the last weeks. Stretching became sacred. You'd wake early just to arch your back slowly against a tree, to kneel gently and let your weight settle into your thighs. It wasn't about flexibility. It was about acknowledging the pain, saying, I see you, I feel you. I'm not ignoring you anymore. The new kind of strength, your muscles weren't stronger in the way you expected. You weren't faster, you weren't sturdier, but you could endure. That was your strength now. You could walk for 10 hours without complaint, carry firewood twice your weight, sleep upright if you had to. You had become capable in ways that had nothing to do with comfort. You had become ... seasoned, not sharp, but resilient. The silent support of others. No one bragged on the trail, but everyone watched out for everyone else. If someone stumbled, a hand caught them. If someone sobbed, no one stared. You passed canteens quietly. You gave someone your last poultice. You took turns resting without guilt. The pain was individual, but the endurance became communal. Rest became a kind of celebration when the wagons halted now. People didn't just rest, they honored it. You lay back, closed your eyes, breathed through your belly, listened to your pulse. Children fell asleep mid-sentence. Adults sat without speaking. The trail had taught you to treasure stillness like a rare fruit. Food tasted like relief by now. Even simple meals tasted sacred. Boiled beans with a pinch of salt, fresh bread, somehow baked, an apple offered by a passing settler. You didn't need feasts. You needed sustenance that didn't bring discomfort. A full belly meant your back could rest easier. A warm broth meant your chest stopped tightening. You ate like someone recovering, not just from hunger, but from motion. The final river when you saw the final river broad. Cold, endless, you didn't cheer. You stopped walking. Let the silence hold you. Let your body feel that it had carried you this far. Some wept, some laughed. Most just stood there, breathing. The water shimmered. Your knees shook. You had made it, but you were not the same. The body after in the weeks that followed. As new settlements welcomed you, your body began to soften again. You walked less, slept on hay or beds. Your hands began to heal. The cracks in your feet closed, but some aches never left. You'd rise from a chair and wince. You'd catch yourself limping without realizing it. The trail never fully left your body. It lived in your muscles, your joints, your posture. It lived in your quiet endurance. You came to the Oregon Trail expecting hardship. You found something stranger, a kind of pain that didn't announce itself, but accumulated slowly like dust in your boots. And in surviving it, you didn't become invincible. You became real, raw, worn-in, human, and that was enough. Let's now drift into a new corner of forgotten history. Story 3. How to die of diarrhea with dignity. Trail medicine in a tin box, the bloody flux. When sickness found you first, asterisk, before the river crossings, before the mountain passes, before the oxen gave out, or the wheels splintered many travelers, met their greatest challenge in a shallow ditch, clutching their stomachs. It began quietly, a cramp, a chill, a bit of unease in the gut, but by sunset it could consume you. Fever, exhaustion, dehydration, and the shameful, constant need to leave the camp and squat in the brush. It was called many things: the flux, the grip, the bowel, sickness, or most commonly dysentery, and it was as much a part of the Oregon Trail as wagon wheels and dust. When your stomach turned, you knew it was coming. Not from a dramatic collapse, but from the heaviness in your belly. You stopped eating. Water tasted wrong. Every smell turned your stomach. Then the diarrhea came violent, frequent, inescapable. You tried to hide it. Everyone did. But soon you were walking behind the wagons with your shirt held around your waist, pale and weak. There was no privacy on the trail, only thin bushes and downcast eyes. A silent epidemic dysentery didn't arrive in a swarm. It crept one child, stopped eating. Then an old man grew sluggish. A mother grew pale. Within days, a quarter of the wagon train was moving more slowly. Fires burned lower. Meals were skipped. The air smelled different sweet. Sour, wrong. You didn't speak of it openly. Naming it made it real. Instead, you whispered, "He's got the flux. She's gone soft in the gut. They're draining," and everyone understood. Dirty water, dirty hands. No one boiled their water at first. Why would they? Streams looked clear. Springs bubbled up from the ground. Rain was fresh, but the truth was cruel. Animals drank upstream. Wagons dumped waste nearby. Hands that tended the sick also stirred the stew pot. The trail was filth made mobile, and the water clean only in appearance carried more danger than the most. Treacherous mountain pass, tin boxes and false hopes. Most families carried a medicine kit, a small tin box filled with remedies, both trusted and untested. Inside, you might find calomel, a mercury compound said to purge illness; laudanum, a mix of alcohol and opium used for pain; castor oil to move the bowels; tincture of rhubarb; quinine powder; a small bottle of spirits; bandages of linen; sulfur. You took what you had, guessed the dosage, and prayed. Sometimes the medicine helped. More often it hastened the decline. The ritual of the Ragwin, the illness struck. The afflicted were given their own cloth rags for wiping, already stiff with use. There were no outhouses, no chamber pots, just earth and embarrassment. You moved to the edge of camp, dug a hole if you could, covered it after. Sometimes the smell followed you. It clung to your clothes, your hands, the air. Still no one judged. Everyone had been there, or would be soon. Feeding the sycopites vanished. But you had to eat at least a little. People boiled rice in too much water, ladled the starchy broth into tin cups. They soaked stale bread in goat's milk. They mashed overripe apples, a spoonful at a time, a swallow, then rest. Those who couldn't keep food down were offered only water, but even that might kill them faster if it came from the wrong stream. You did what you could, and watched, and waited. The burden of care someone had to stay with the sick, wipe their mouths, change their soiled blankets, hold their head when they vomited. These caregivers were often mothers, sisters, older children. They slept less, ate less, they grew hot-eyed. And when they got sick too, no one was surprised. There was no choice. You cared for your own, even when it meant joining them. Fevers that burned slow dysentery came with fever. Not always, but often enough. The skin burned, lips cracked, eyes rolled. You mumbled strange things about home, about animals, about snow. Cold cloths were pressed to your brow. Water trickled down your throat. Sometimes a piece of wood was placed between your teeth. If the fever broke, you lived. If it didn't, you faded like a lantern run dry. The shame of the body what made dysentery cruel wasn't just the pain, it was the humiliation. You, who had once dressed carefully and ate with a fork, now soiled yourself in view of strangers. You cried from exhaustion, from loss of control, from knowing that no one could help, and yet no one mocked. Everyone understood. The trail humbled everyone. Especially here, the earth, as Nursum, found comfort in the natural world. They boiled willow bark for tea, chewed mint for nausea, applied damp clay to fevered skin. You lay on the ground and listened to the wind. You counted stars at night when the cramping eased. The earth became your sickbed, and sometimes your comfort. When the medicine made it, worse calomel stripped the lining of the gut. Laudanum stopped the symptoms, but masked the danger. Families argued, should they dose again? Should they try something else? Should they stop everything and just wait? You learned the hard way that medicine was more hope than science, more guess than cure. The decision to stop sometimes. You just stopped walking. You lay beneath the wagon, curled into yourself. You could go no farther, and still, the wagon train moved. If you were lucky, someone stayed behind. If not, they left water, a blanket, and a whispered prayer. There were no choices, only realities. The comfort of opium in the final stages. You were often given laudanum not to cure, but to ease the journey out. 1 spoonful silenced the pain, 2 brought sleep, 3 stopped the breath. Sometimes it was accidental, sometimes not. No one spoke of it afterward, but everyone knew, marking. The place when someone died, there wasn't time for mourning. A shallow grave was dug, a cross carved quickly. Sometimes a bonnet or boots were left nearby. The others moved on. You couldn't stay. You couldn't afford to. The sickness stayed behind, but its memory walked with you. You didn't plan to die like this. No one did, but the trail didn't ask. The trail didn't care. And in your final moments, surrounded by dust, bitter tea, and the worn hands of someone who loved you, you found a strange kind of dignity. Not in strength, but in being seen. Herbs, spirits, and hope. When the cure wasn't science, asterisk, not all medicine came in bottles. Not every cure came from a tin box. On the Oregon Trail, when sickness arrived, and it always did, people turned to what they had. Herbs, prayers, poultices, boiled roots, whispered charms, and half-remembered recipes passed down in kitchens and CHAPLS. It was medicine of the desperate, of the faithful, of the curious, and of the forgotten. When belief was the strongest medicines, belief did more than calomel. A mother would kneel beside her child, not with laudanum, but with her hands. She'd murmur songs she barely remembered, press her palm to the child's brow, and whisper the names of saints or plants, or rivers, or dead relatives, and the child would rest, not cured, but soothed. Sometimes the body followed where the spirit had already begun to heal. The book, with no title, many wagons, carried a little book, sometimes bound in leather, sometimes just folded pages. No title, no author, just a collection of cures. Chokeberry, syrup for belly swelling. Cold feet mean trouble in the gut. Boil elm bark, add lard, use for boils. Some pages were stained with grease. Others had comments. Worked for Clara. Don't trust this one. It wasn't science. It wasn't faith. It was something older. the medicine of trial, error, and hope. The medicine women in nearly every train, there was someone who knew. Things she wasn't a doctor. She had no papers. But she had stories of grandmothers who healed fevers with onion poultices, of tinctures stirred with iron spoons, of teas made from plants found nowhere in books. Others looked to her when medicine men failed. She was respected, feared. Sometimes she carried jars, bundles of dried leaves, and oils that smelled of camphor and cloves. She'd run her fingers over your wrist, then decide if you needed heat or cold, sweetness or salt, and people got better. Sometimes, spirits in a bottle whiskey was more than drink. It was remedy, rubbed on wounds, poured into ears, used to clean tools. A shot before sleep calmed the nerves. 2 shots made you forget the infection creeping up your leg. Babies were rubbed. With it, dogs were dosed with it. No one doubted its power. Even if it never cured, it made suffering quieter, and sometimes that was enough. Leaves that whispered healing along the trail. Certain plants became legends. Travelers would point them out to each other. That one stops bleeding. This one calms the belly. Don't touch, that'll blind you. Slippery elm, yarrow, horehound, elderflower, wild mint, skullcap, names whispered like spells. A single leaf might be tucked into a pouch, crushed into paste, steeped into a bitter brew. They didn't always work, but they felt old, ancient, wise, and you trusted them more than powders from a broken jar. Poultices and hopeful wrappings if you had a boil, a swelling, a strange rash, or a sore that wouldn't close. Someone would make a poultice, mustard and vinegar, onion and garlic, boiled bread, crusts, lard and pine resin, wrapped in cloth, pressed to skin, changed with care. Sometimes the infection shrank. Sometimes the skin healed. Sometimes you just smelled bad and kept walking. But the care meant something. That someone tried. Eggs, smoke. An animal magic, cold world remedies clung to the new world. Some still believed in drawing out the bad humors. Hard-boiled eggs placed under the bed. Smoke blown into ears. A feather passed over the stomach. You didn't ask why. You just watched. A mother might kill a chicken and bury it at a crossroads to stop her child's fever. Was it foolish? Perhaps. But on the trail, foolishness often looked like bravery. Moon water and starlight certain families carried charms. Little bottles of water charged under a full moon. They swore by its clarity. Used it to rinse wounds, dripped it onto eyelids. Of the sick, starlight too was considered sacred. Some believed sleeping with your head under the stars would clear bad dreams and slow fevers. One child recovered after being carried beneath the night sky for 3 hours. The parents never doubted the cause. Cures carved into wood you might see. Someone etching strange symbols into a stick, then placing it beneath a mattress. It was a German thing, they'd say, or Welsh, or something from the old country. Protection for the soul, for the body. No one laughed. You never laughed at anyone trying to heal, because it meant they still believed. Healing was possible. The silence of men were less likely to ask for help. They hid injuries, downplayed fevers. When a man finally asked for a remedy, it was serious. He might take the bitter root, drink the ash tea, swallow the whiskey, then go silent again, back to work, back to the wagon tongue or the yoke. Healing, for men, often meant pretending they were already well, which marks and trails superstition. Some believed the trail itself was cursed, that certain stretches bred illness. One hill, they said, had taken 6 children in 6 weeks. Another bend was where every oxen stumbled. You marked the wagon wheels with chalk, tied red thread round your ankle, kept coins under your pillow. Superstition was cheap. It cost nothing. And if it kept death at Baven, for a day you honored it. Prayers as prescription they prayed. Of course they prayed, each in their own way. The Baptists prayed with heads bowed low. The Catholics whispered to saints. The Methodists sang. The spiritualists called out loud. Some wrote their prayers on paper and tucked them in boots. Others carved initials into trees. You asked for healing. But more often, you asked for endurance. And sometimes you received it. Death as a kind of medicine. Death was the only thing that stopped the pain. You watched a man racked with coughing finally fall still. His wife said, "He's resting now." You watched a child with fevered eyes go quiet, and his mother said, "He's not hurting anymore." It wasn't peace, not really, but it was stillness. And after weeks of screaming and fever, stillness felt like mercy. The legacy of trying none of these cures were perfect. Many were useless. Some were dangerous, but each was an act of hope. You boiled, steeped, crushed, stirred. You wrapped and prayed and waited. You knelt beside the sick. You pressed cool hands to hot foreheads. You stayed up through the night to whisper stories. That was medicine to dot the belief that someone was worth healing, worth saving, and in that belief, something sacred stirred. Grief, ritual, and the quiet end of illness asterisk. There was no funeral parlor on the Oregon Trail, no embalmer, no satin-lined box. When death came as, it so often did it, came without ceremony, without warning, without rest. And still, the living made space for grief. They carved meaning from silence. They folded mourning into motion. They whispered farewells over shallow graves and then walked on, shoulders heavy not just with provisions, but with sorrow. This was how you died and how you were remembered when the trail was both your healer and your executioner. The final. Watch long before the breath stopped. You could see it in the eyes. A glassiness, a slow fading, a gaze fixed not on the world, but on something far beyond it. Someone sat beside you always, someone, even if you were disliked, even if you were difficult, no one died alone if it could be helped. They soaked a cloth in water and dabbed your lips, held your hand, murmured nonsense just to keep sound in the air. They watched, because watching was all they had left to give. Death at dawnmost died just before sunrise. Not always, but often enough that people noticed. They said it was because the body tried to make it through one more night, or maybe because the cold was too much. When it happened, there was no wailing, no screams, just the quiet exhale of someone no longer fighting. And then a slow rustling blankets moved, tears wiped. Someone stood to wake the others. The trail began again, even as death lingered. The burial ground was wherever you were there. Was no cemetery, no family plot. The dead were buried where they fell or close to it, sometimes in a grove of trees, sometimes beside a river, often in dry, dusty earth that fought the shovel with every stroke, a shallow grave, a plank, if one could be spared, a cross made from wagon scrap, a name carved or not. You covered the body with stones when you had them, to keep the wolves away, and then you walked. What you left with them, you placed small things with the dead, a bonnet, a child's toy, a tin spoon, a note, if you could write. Bible verse spoken aloud, a hymn hummed more than song. Sometimes just a whispered apology for things unsaid, for hurts never healed, for being unable to do more. These were not gifts, they were anchors. They were love, disguised as practical things. When the children died, it was always worst when it was a child. They weakened quickly, their cries faded, their bodies too small to fight, gave in easily. Parents didn't scream, they just folded in on themselves. The child was dressed in their best, whatever best meant, after weeks on the trail. The burial was quieter, and then the family walked. Not because they had healed, but because there was no alternative. The empty blanket when someone died, their bedroll was rolled tighter, their plate packed away, their name left out of the morning count. That emptiness was louder than words. At night, someone might stare at the fire too long, or sing to themselves softly. The grief did not demand drama. It lived quietly in the routine, in the things no longer done. Talking about the dead you, spoke of them carefully, not right away. Sometimes not for days, but eventually you mentioned their name again. Mary always made the coffee too strong. Tom never liked beans. Lena would have hated this wind. The laughter was soft, sad, but it brought color back into the air. And in those moments, the dead felt close again. The medicine left behind when someone died. Their medicine kit was often divided. A half-used bottle of laudanum, bandages, herbs tied in twine. You used it with reverence, sometimes suspicion, sometimes fear. You were grateful, and you were careful, because you knew how close those things had come to working and failing. The dreams of the sick often spoke of strange things before they died. They saw mothers, rivers, bright birds, spoke in languages they never knew. You didn't question them, you just listened. Sometimes you believed, if only for a moment, that the veil between this world and the next was thinner on the trail. The weight you carried you didn't just carry the wounded. You carried the dead, not their bodies, but their memory. You remembered the way someone folded their blanket, the sound of their cough, their odd jokes, their kindness. Every mile forward made their absence louder. You carried that quietly, always. Morning in ocean, there was no time to pause, to weep for days, to wear black or hang crepe. Grief moved with the wagon. You cried while stirring beans. You grieved while lifting firewood. You remembered while mending shoes. The work didn't stop, but neither did the ache. Healing without healing. People never recovered. Not from illness, from loss. They walked, they cooked, they carried. But something in them had gone silent. Their eyes were glacier, their laughter forced. They lived but they did not return, not fully. The rituals made up on the trailing the absence of church bells. People invented their own rituals. A hand placed over a grave, a stone carried for miles, then left behind. A lullaby sung to no one. You marked the calendar. You cooked their favorite food, if you could. You stared at the stars and said their name. These rituals weren't taught. They were born from need. Ghosts who walked beside you, you saw them sometimes. Not literally, but in the corner of your eye, someone walking beside you. A familiar laugh, a gesture. Grief made echoes, and on the trail, where everything repeated, those echoes stayed loud. The blessing of survival, those who survived didn't boast. They didn't say, I made it. They said, we lost 3, or I thought I wouldn't, or I'm still here. Survival wasn't pride. It was surprise, sometimes guilt, often gratitude, but never certainty. When you finally rest, journey's end, your body collapsed, but your mind kept walking. You woke in the night expecting to hear coughing, to find someone fevered. It took weeks to feel safe again, to let your shoulders drop, to breathe deeply, and even then, some part of you stayed on that trail. You did not choose to become a caretaker, a healer, a griever, a witness, but the trail made you all these things, and in watching others suffer, you discovered your own strength, your own patience, your own deep and quiet compassion. You did not save everyone, but you tried, and in that trying, there was something holy. Let's now drift again to new dust, new stories, and new forgotten moments. Story 4. 50 Shades of Dull. The endless chores of life on the mooster. Fold, fetch, repeat. Chores that never ended. Asterisk. The Oregon Trail was not just a journey across miles of untamed land. It was a daily loop of chores, repetitive, quiet, endlessly necessary. No trumpets marked the start of your day. No glory in boiling dirty socks or cleaning soot-caked pans. But without these rituals, the wagons would not move. The families would not eat. The wheels would fall apart. The bodies break down. So you stirred, you folded, you fetched, and then you did it again. A morning of cold hands and warm ash. The day began with fire. Always fire. Someone rose early, usually a woman, sometimes a child, crouched beside the fire pit, fingers numb, sleeves damp, knees in dew-soaked grass. If the coals still held a spark, they blew gently, fed it twigs, then chips of dried dung, then the larger pieces. If the fire had died completely, they started from scratch. Steel, smoke, patience. The fire was more than heat. It was the engine of the entire morning. Breakfast wasn't a meal. It was a task. Cooking wasn't leisure. It was labor. The beans from last night were reheated. Cornmeal was mixed with water and salt. Hardtack was soaked until it was chewable. Coffee, if you had any, was reheated and thinned. Children were fed first, then men, then the women, with whatever was left. There was no sitting. You ate while stirring, or standing, or walking to wake. The next sleeper, you ate quickly, quietly, and only enough to keep moving. Dishes were a dusty affair. Washing dishes meant fetching water. Not always nearby, sometimes a quarter mile away. You scrubbed with cloths already stiff from yesterday's grease. If you had lye soap, you used it sparingly. Most just used sand and hot water. Pots were set near the fire to dry. Plates wiped and stacked. Cutlery tied together in rags to keep them from being lost. And just like that, it was time to pack. The art of packing the wagon every morning. The entire world had to be loaded back into the wagon. Blankets folded, barrels lifted, crates shoved into tight corners. Children helped, or got in the way, or did both. You had to balance everything: weight against axle, food against supplies, space against comfort. One mistake meant a cracked barrel, a broken jar, a bruised child. There were no shortcuts, just muscle memory and care. Laundry was a weekly battle once. A week if water was near you. Did laundry dock clothes were soaked in tubs or buckets, or even holes lined with waxed canvas. If you had soap, you used it on the worst stains. If not, you scrubbed with sand and hot water. Clothes were beaten on rocks, wrung by hand, hung on ropes strung between wagons. They dried, stiff, uneven, but clean, cleanish, Laundry day was not rest day. It was a work day like any other, only wetter. The endless hunt for water wasn't just for drinking. It was for washing, cooking, soaking, cooling, cleaning, and it had to be carried every drop. You walked, sometimes for hours, with tin pails knocking against your knees. You filtered through cloth. You let sediment settle. You boiled it when you had fuel to spare. Water was life, and water took work. Clothing repairs in the shade while others fetched or cooked. Someone sat with a needle, tears in trousers, buttons missing, sleeves unraveling. A single needle was precious, thread even more so. You reused it, knotted it, stretched it. You sewed in the shade of a wagon, with sore fingers and squinting eyes, and when you were done, you found more to fix. Gathering buffalo chips fuel had to come from somewhere. Out on the plains, there were no trees, just dry air and dry dung dot. Buffalo chips were light, flaky, and scattered. Children were sent to gather them in sacks. They giggled at first, then complained, then got used to it. Everyone did, because fire couldn't wait for dignity. Meal prep wasn't a moment hit, was a marathon meals took. Hours to prepare. You soaked beans in the morning. You started fires long before hunger arrived. Chopping vegetables meant bending over the same wooden board again and again. You stirred constantly to avoid scorching. You tasted cautiously. You rationed salt like gold dust. And when the meal was done, you started thinking about the next. Sweeping the wagons inside the wagons. Dirt collected like water in a leaky boat. You swept it with handmade brooms bundles of stiff grass or old twine. You cleared out the crumbs, the bugs, the little bones from last night's dinner. It didn't stay clean for long, but it helped. Mending shoes and spirit shoes wore out fast. The soles came apart. Laces snapped. Leather cracked. Someone always had to sit and stitch, with wire if you had it, with sinew if not. You patched holes. You rubbed grease into cracked heels. You muttered about doing it all again next week. The work was never glamorous, but it was something you could fix. The emotional weight of doing it all again, * some burdens couldn't be carried in wagons. They sat on your shoulders, lurking behind your eyes. They were born not from danger, but from repetition, from the heavy quiet of doing the same thing, every day, without thanks. This was the emotional side of trail labor. Not just the calluses and ash-stained skirts, but the sighs you didn't let anyone hear. The small, invisible work of keeping yourself and everyone else from falling apart. You were always tired. Not the dramatic kind of tired. Not the collapse in two-bed kind, but the soft, endless ache of moving without stopping. You woke tired. You walked tired. You cleaned with hands that had already done too much, and still you kept going, because rest wasn't an option. Not really. Not here. The chores never waited drain, didn't stop the work. Nor did wind, nor grief, nor hunger. The soup still had to be stirred. The tent mended. The pot cleaned. The children dressed. It didn't matter if you'd slept, if your leg hurt, if your heart did. Chores didn't ask questions. They just waited for hands. Small acts, big meanings. Sometimes a single small thing would break you. A button popping off for the third time. A child spilling the last of the coffee. A spoon falling into the fire. You didn't scream, not usually, but your breath caught. Your hands trembled, because it wasn't the thing itself. It was what it meant. You'd have to do it all again. From the beginning, The quiet rage of women. Women bore most of the labor. They cooked, packed, fetched, sewed, soothed, and still had to smile. There were days you wanted to scream into the prairie, to hurl a pot across the clearing. But instead, you stirred more quietly. You pressed harder when needing. You whispered prayers not of peace, but of release. And then you swept the wagon again. Men's chores, different painsmen labored to lift barrels, driving oxen, repairing wheels, guarding the perimeter. Their exhaustion looked different. Broader shoulders, shorter tempers. They bore pain silently, worked themselves numb, hid injuries for fear of shame. Sometimes they sat on stumps, staring at nothing. Not lazy, just hollow. They didn't always know how to say they were tired, so they kept working. Children grew up. Mid-task children weren't spared, not even the small ones. They collected buffalo chips, dusted plates, helped yoke the oxen. They learned chores before letters, grew calluses before full teeth. Laughter came between jobs. Play was a broom handle turned into a horse, then back into a broom again. The trail didn't let them stay children long. The fight over fairness arguments always came back to chores. She never helps. He always gets out of washing. Why do I have to cook again? It wasn't about the task. It was about being seen. Work divided, unevenly left. Splinters, silent ones. And some never came out. The quiet joy of finishing something still, when you finished a task. However small, there was satisfaction. A pot scrubbed clean, a sleeve repaired, a fire that caught on the first try. You didn't throw parties, but you exhaled. You allowed yourself to feel proud, and then moved on to the next thing. Social chores were real chores. Wasn't just physical labor. There was social labor, too. You had to smile, to check on others, to hold the baby so someone else could rest, to play peacekeeper when tempers flared. You had to ask, how are you holding up? Even when you weren't holding up at all. It was invisible work, but real and exhausting. Breaks that weren't breaks. Sitting down didn't mean rest. You sewed while sitting, peeled potatoes, braided rope, repaired harnesses. Even at rest, you worked. And in the rare moments you were truly still, your body ached in strange places, as if unused to stillness. Dreams of doing nothing. You dreamed not of riches, or feasts, or success. You dreamed of silence, of sitting beside a fire with no meal to cook, of lying in grass with no reason to rise, of hours that didn't belong to anyone but you. That dream kept you going. Laughing became resistance when the work became too much. You laughed at burnt biscuits, at lopsided tents, at mud that swallowed shoes. It wasn't always funny, but the laughter kept you upright. It was defiance, a reminder that even in monotony, you still had something left of yourself. Shared chores built strange friendships. You bonded with those who shared the burden. 2 women shelling peas, 2 boys chasing a runaway mule, a man helping another lash a barrel into place. Words weren't always necessary. Chores became a language, a way to say, I see you, I'm tired too. Let's keep going. Jealousy in tiny forms, you envied those with a working coffee pot, a good needle, a child who slept through the night. It wasn't bitterness, just longing. You didn't resent them. You just wished your work was slightly easier, and you never said it out loud. The silence that came at night at day's end, when the fire dimmed, the wagons were packed, and the food was gone. You sat, not to talk, not to think, just to breathe. Mind didn't wander. It idled. You watched sparks rise, watched stars appear, listened to the sounds of others doing the same. Together, quiet, exhausted, and somehow at peace. Legacy in the laundry. How chores became history. Asterisk. There are no statues of the woman who boiled shirts in a bent pot for 7 days straight. No songs for the boy who swept out the same wagon 50 times in silence. And yet, without them, the Oregon Trail would have failed. Not in some poetic sense, but in the practical, exacting math of survival. Chores weren't side notes. They were the unspoken contract between life and death, between progress and collapse. They were the backbone of the journey, and they left a legacy written not in stone, but in routine. The chores were the culture. Every wagon train developed its own rhythm, its own code. Who gathered dung, who cooked, who boiled water, who mended socks. You could tell a lot about a family by how they split their work. Who grumbled, who volunteered, who disappeared when it was time to lift. Chores weren't just tasks, they were identity. They told you who someone was. The unnamed roles. Some people were known not by their titles, but by their chores. She's the one who always gets the fire going. He sharpens everyone's blades. That boy, he watches the mules. It wasn't fame, it was recognition. And out here, that mattered. When chores were the only thing left when you lost someone, you did their work. It was never a choice. It was never questioned. You picked up the needle, hauled the water, darned the socks. Not because you knew how, but because someone had to. And in doing it, you remembered them, their hands, their way, their hum while working. The chore became their echo. Stories told through repetition. You didn't always talk while working, but when you did, the best stories came out. Grandmothers remembered old kitchens. Fathers talked about war. Children imagined cities made of soup spoons. The trail taught you to mix memory with movement, to let your past ride alongside your present. Rituals inside the repetition, the way you folded blankets, the way you stirred beans clockwise, the way you tied rope into a loop instead of a knot. These weren't rules, they were comforts. Rituals made from muscle memory, tiny acts that gave meaning to monotony. They were your version of home. Chores, as inheritance. Children learned how to care from what they saw. A girl watched her mother patch the hem. A boy noticed how his father wiped every tool before putting it away. These weren't just skills, they were values. Teachings without lectures, passed down through blisters and routine. The quiet pride in completion. You rarely heard thank you, but you knew when a job was done right. The fire stayed lit, the beans didn't burn, the wagon didn't tip. You felt it in the silence that followed, a kind of still satisfaction. The world didn't applaud, but it didn't fall apart either. That was enough. Chores during grief when loss came. The chores remained, and in that they were a strange comfort. You didn't know what to say, but you knew how to sweep, to boil, to stitch. The motions became your morning, your therapy, your way forward. They gave your hands something to do while your heart healed. The repetition was the reminder. Every sock mended reminded you that someone still had to walk. Every pot scrubbed meant another meal could happen. Every log chopped meant the fire would glow through another dark night. The task itself was never heroic, but its impact was. Bonding through blister, the people you worked beside became family. Not because you liked them, but because you shared sweat, shared silence, shared small victories. You remembered who helped lift the stuck barrel, who offered their extra thread, who scrubbed your pot when you had nothing left. That kind of bond doesn't need words. Laughter inside the mundane, there were moments of joy. Real ones. Someone burned the biscuit suganand, laughed so hard they cried. Someone painted a face on the soap. A toddler dragged a pot like a drum and made everyone dance. These moments mattered. They made the chores bearable. They made the days brighter. The chores became the trail by the end. You realized something strange. The journey wasn't just made of rivers and hills. It was made of chores. That's where your memories lived. In the hum of a kettle, the scrape of a knife, the slap of wet laundry on a rock. The chores were the heartbeat of the trail, steady, unnoticed. Vital legacy in leftover threads when you reached the end. The chores didn't stop, but they changed. You found yourself folding blankets the same way, stirring the same way, rationing water without thinking. These weren't just habits, they were echoes of months spent surviving, of lessons carved deep into your bones, remembering through work years later, when someone boiled a pot over an open flame, you remembered. When someone asked how you learned to mend socks so quickly, you answered on the trail. The work lived on in your hands. In your rhythm, you didn't just remember what happened, you remembered what you did, over and over, without applause. The trail didn't reward work, but it remembered there were no medals, no promotions, no titles, but the trail held your labor in its grooves, its wagon ruts, its ashes buried in old fire pits. Every pebble cleared from a path, every pot hung just right. Every bit of grease that saved a wheel, the land remembered. Even if no one else did, you may not remember every mile, every landmark, but you'll remember the feel of a wooden spoon, the weight of a water bucket, the warmth of finished work. You'll remember the hush that came after the last pot was cleaned, the silence of earned sleep. The chores made you, not grandly, but completely and in the quietest ways. They kept you alive. Let's now drift softly into a new, forgotten chapter. Story 5. Oxen, Oaths, and Outhouses. The unseen labor of getting anywhere the animal engine, keeping the wheels in motion, asterisk. You might imagine the Oregon Trail as a grand voyage, a rolling adventure across open land. But when you walked it, truly walked it, you learned the truth. You weren't crossing a continent, you were managing a team. And not just people, animals, wagons, wheels, weather, waste, and everything. Everything depended on motion, not speed. Not glory, just forward. But forward required effort. Every day, oxen, the beasts that bore it. Almost people didn't ride horses. Horses were fast, yes, proud, but too fragile, too prone to injury. Oxen were the real heroes, slow, stubborn, but dependable. They didn't bolt. They didn't panic at creaks. They just trudged. 2 oxen could pull thousands of pounds of wagon and supplies. 4 was better. 6 was a blessing. You walked beside them, talked to them, cursed them. They were not pets. They were engines, living, breathing engines that stopped. For no one, unless they chose to. Learning the language of animals, you didn't just tell oxen to go. You spoke their language. G to turn right, haw for left, whoa to stop, get up to go. You clicked your tongue, whistled, tapped them with a stick, and if they trusted you, they listened. If they didn't, they stood there, chewing.org. The morning every morning began with the yoke, a wooden beam set across the shoulders of your team. A wooden beam set across the shoulders of your team. You checked for sores first, calluses, infections. A bad harnessing could cripple them. You padded the yoke with old cloth, rubbed balm into cracked skin, tightened the wooden pins. It was a quiet ritual. No one talked much during it. There was respect in that moment. You were asking them to carry your life again. What the wagon's weighed your wagon was, not light it carried. Food, bedding, tools, spare wheels, dishes, maybe a trunk of books, maybe a child, maybe someone too sick to walk. Even empty, it groaned under its own weight. Fully packed, it needed careful handling, brakes going downhill, patience going up. You never let it run ahead, never let it tip. The wagon wasn't just wood and wheels. It was your house, and you protected it like one. Greasing the axles wagons, squeaked loudly, constantly. The only way to quiet them was grease lard, bacon fat, bear grease if you had it. Every few days, you crawled underneath and slathered it on, sticky, smelly, essential, no grease, and the wheels locked. Broke. You didn't need to be strong, just persistent, careful, and willing to come out covered in axle. Grease, the oath of the teamster, driving a wagon was a sacred trust. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy. You walked beside your animals, not in front, not behind, beside. You watched their steps, noticed the first limp, the first hesitation. You read the trail through their reactions, and when the time came to cross water, to push through mud, to go uphill, you didn't shout, you urged, you coaxed, you led. Always. When animals failed, they sometimes collapsed. In the heat, in the cold, from thirst, from exhaustion, they knelt, refused to move, sometimes cried. You poured water into their mouths, rubbed their legs, spoke softly, and if they didn't rise, you made a choice. You waited, or you left them. Behind it was never easy, but it was common, the sound of forwardy. Moving wagon train had a particular rhythm, the creak of wheels, the clink of harness, the soft thuds of hooves, and behind it, voices, orders, jokes, songs, prayers. It was the sound of persistence, of barely controlled momentum, and when it stopped, suddenly you knew something was wrong. Watering the team oxen needed water, more than you, more than the children. Every few miles, you paused for it. If there was a stream, you led them in. If there wasn't, you rationed from the barrels. No water, no movement. You never let them go thirsty. Not twice. That lesson came quickly and hard. Manure and morality with animals came waste. Constantly it fell in the trail. Around camp, under wagons. You didn't ignore it. You shoveled it, dried it, used it for fuel. You understood the cycle of work, waste, work again, and you didn't complain. Not because it wasn't disgusting, but because it was necessary. The art of the turn wagons didn't turn easily. You needed space, time, the right timing, tight. Curves meant unhitching, pushing, turning by hand. You learned the terrain like a carpenter learns wood grain. You anticipated slope, mud, rock, dot. Every turn was a decision, every rut a risk. Repairs without manuals, wheels cracked, brakes jammed, yokes split. You didn't have replacements. You had rope, nails, a saw. Solutions. Wrapped wood with twine, used belts as clamps, and it worked. Not forever, but long enough. The heat, the cold, the motion movement didn't stop for weather. In heat, oxen slowed. In cold, metal snapped. In rain, wheels sank. You walked through it, drove through it, swore through it. You layered, unlayered, draped canvas over the wagon. Like a second skin, you endured, because stopping was worse. Quiet command, the hidden order behind the wagon's asterisk to the casual eye. A wagon train might have looked like a wandering crowd, dozens of wagons plodding across the landscape, people on foot, animals meandering, but inside that moving mass was something more structured. Invisible lines, unspoken rules, quiet roles. Getting from Missouri to Oregon required more than just wheels and willpower. It required leadership, planning, a sense of when to move, and more importantly, when not to. This was the government of the trail, not imposed, not formal, but deeply real. The captain was elected most. Wagon trains began with a vote, a quiet gathering, a few names suggested, a few hands raised. The captain wasn't a military leader. He wasn't always the strongest or loudest, but he knew people, knew animals, knew how to read the sky. His job wasn't to command, it was to keep things together, to keep things moving. The captain walked, he didn't ride up front with a flag. He walked beside the first wagon. Watching the ground, he spoke with drivers, checked on oxen, adjusted course based on weather, rivers, or rumor. He rarely gave orders. Mostly, he asked questions, listened, suggested, and when he did speak firmly, people listened. The morning meeting each day began with a short meeting. Wagon leaders, trusted voices, a circle in the early light, boots wet with dew. What direction today? How far? Which creek? Which hazard ahead? No ceremony, just decisions, made quickly, and then the day began. Starting was always the hardest getting. Moving was harder than staying in motion. The animals needed coaxing. The children needed dressing. The pots needed tying down. The captain gave a signal, usually a hand wave or short call, and slowly, creak by creak, the line came to life. The order of the train, the strongest wagons often went first. They broke trail, chose pace. Weaker wagons stayed near the center, close to help if something broke. Scouts rode ahead, sometimes on foot, sometimes on mules. The rear held those who straggled, the injured, the weary dot. Each position mattered, each. One earned scouts saw what wasn't there. The scouts weren't just map readers. They were trail readers. They spotted new ruts, watched animal tracks, measured clouds, noted wind direction. Sometimes they came back with warnings, sometimes with alternate routes. They rarely spoke much, but when they did, people listened. The map was often wrong. Maps were old, incomplete, sometimes entirely fictional. Rivers had changed, landmarks had vanished, trails had forked, so the captains relied on instinct, on memory, on travelers passing in the opposite direction. You didn't follow a path. You created one. Breakdowns meant rearrangements when a wagon broke, and one always did. The train adapted. People stopped, helped, unloaded, rebalanced the load, among others. One broken wheel slowed everyone, but no one complained, because next time it could be yours. Disputes were handled, in quiet arguments happened. Over space, over pace, over noise. They were settled at night, away from the fire, with quiet voices and calm hands. Public shame helped no one. The trail needed unity, and unity required. Softness food wasn't shared equally, but it was shared each family. carried their own provisions, but hunger was rarely ignored. If someone lost a barrel, others contributed. You didn't give much, just enough, a scoop of beans, a square of bread, and when it was your turn, they'd do the same. Water was everyone's concern when the barrels ran low. It didn't matter whose oxen was thirsty. People scouted together, dug together, carried together. There were no debates about ownership when the water came from the same earth. Dangerous crossings called for council creeks, canyons, mud pits. These were moments that paused everything. People gathered, talked, weighed options, rope lines were strung. Animals were unhitched. Children watched quietly, sensing the seriousness in the air. The sound of consensus decisions didn't come from shouting. They came from murmurs, gestures, a nod from one man, a soft agreed from another, and slowly, the group moved as one, not always efficiently, but always together. The midday rest-even movement needed pause. At noon, the wagons stopped. Shade was found. Food was chewed. Oxen lay down. People washed hands. Someone played a harmonica. It wasn't leisure, but it was breath. And breath mattered. Dig, squat, cover the humble hygiene of the trail. Asterisk if movement was the muscle of the trail. Waste was its constant byproduct, and like everything else out here, it had to be managed. Carefully, quietly, daily. You might not think history has much to say about going to the bathroom, but out here, it meant everything. Cleanliness, privacy, decency, health. The Oregon Trail didn't have outhouses, but it had routines, rules, and 1,000 unspoken understandings about what to do with what your body couldn't keep. There was no bathroom, that's the first truth. There were no buildings, no seats, no stalls. There was grass, brush, open space, rocks, and you. Privacy was earned. To relieve yourself, you walked away from camp, not far enough to be alone, but far enough to pretend women walked together, carrying shawls or blankets. Men found trees or knelt behind bushes. No one talked about it, but everyone knew it was a part of the day, like brushing your teeth. Except there were no toothbrushes. The latrine was a hole. You dug a hole, squatted over it, did your business, covered it, sometimes with dirt, sometimes with ashes, sometimes not at all. If you were careful, you picked a spot downhill, downwind, and away from the water source. If you weren't, people got sick. Children needed help. Toddlers didn't understand sanitation. Mothers carried rags. Fathers dug extra holes. Older siblings wiped with leaves. Potty training on the trail was flexible. You accepted messes. You cleaned with what you had, and you didn't blame them, after all. Most adults barely managed either. Wiping was improvised. There was no toilet paper. You used leaves, cloth scraps, corn husks, old newspapers, smooth stones. Your hand and then water. You adapted. You became resourceful. You never looked at leaves the same way again. Waste and water didn't mix, one rule. Repeated often. Never relieve yourself near a water source. It was easy to forget, but costly. Contaminated water meant dysentery, cholera, typhoid, so you walked. Further, took more time. Dug deeper, because if you didn't, someone paid the price. The women's walk women had it harder. Always, they had to manage. Modesty, menstruation, childbirth, weakness. They walked together, not for gossip, but for protection, for quiet, for kindness. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just needed a moment away from everything. Men were less careful. Men were quicker, less concerned with modesty. They relieved themselves beside wagons, behind wheels, wherever was convenient. Sometimes it caused tension. Sometimes it caused illness. But mostly, it was just a fact of life. The morning rush at dawn, before the fire, before breakfast, people disappeared briefly. Everyone pretended not to notice. You didn't make eye contact with someone walking back from the trees with a shovel. You let them return, greeted them like they'd just been picking flowers. Sanitary buckets for the sick. Those too ill to walk were given buckets, lined with rags, emptied discreetly. Someone, usually a spouse, a child, carried it away each morning. There was no pride in it, but there was care, because the sick still had dignity, and the healthy preserved it. Menstruation was managed in silence. Rags were used, washed discreetly, dried away from view. Women didn't talk about it, not even to each other, unless they were close, but they shared supplies, shared knowledge, shared warmth when the cramps came. It wasn't shame, it was survival. The rag by every wagon had one sometimes tied outside, sometimes buried in the pack. It held cloths too worn to patch, but too useful to discard. They became wipes, pads, bandages, diaper liners. They smelled, but they were essential. Babies meant more work. Infants had no control. Mothers carried extra cloth, tucked rags in swaddles, changed them beside fires. Diapering was a constant chore. You washed the cloth in river water, hung it to dry on wagon spokes. It never dried fast enough, but it had to be done. Camps smelled like life. No, one expected a camp to smell good. There was the smoke, the food, the sweat, the animals, and the waste. It wasn't offensive. It was just part of the air. You got used to it. You had to, digging deeper at night before sleep. Someone walked the perimeter, not to guard, but to clean. They checked for waste left uncovered, dug deeper holes, covered old ones with sand. It wasn't noble work, but it was necessary. It kept the animals away, the flies, the sickness. It let people sleep more peacefully when people didn't bother sometimes. Someone didn't walk far enough, didn't dig deep enough. It caused friction, quiet scolding, silent judgment, not because of the smell, but because of the danger. Disease didn't care about pride, it cared about proximity. Rain was a blessing, and a curse. Rain washed everything away. Smells, waste, footprints, but it also filled holes, exposed what was buried, carried contaminants into creeks. You welcomed the cool, the clean, but you watched the runoff closely. The final act of every day after meals, after fire, after prayers, you walked out one last time, just you and the dark. A shovel, a cloth, a few quiet minutes with the wind. You relieved yourself, not just your body, but your thoughts. And when you returned, you were ready for sleep. We don't talk about waste in stories, but out here, it was everything. A measure of health, a cause of death, a shared, silent ritual that bound you to the earth and to each other. You did it with dignity. You did it with patience. And you did it every single day. Let's now drift onward into the quiet glow of another forgotten chapter.